Good morning, everyone. Sorry. I'll wait a few seconds so everybody can join us. Good. Good morning, everyone. Welcome to our session number 5 of the Research Data Management Workshop, which will last until December with weekly sessions. I would like to start stating that we pay respect to Algonquin people who are the traditional guardians of this land. We acknowledge their long-standing relationship with this territory, which remains unceded. We pay respect to all Indigenous people in this region from all nations across Canada who call Ottawa home. We acknowledge the traditional knowledge keepers, both young and old, and we honor their courageous leaders, past, present, and future. So I would like to remind you that the 2 next sessions are already open for registration. So on October 17, we'll have Indigenous Data and Open Science intersection with Dr. Aaron Franks. And on October 24, we have the TMP assistant describing the tool with Dr. Elisa Rod and Shiloh Williams. Also, as a part of our activities, I would like to invite you, if you are keen to, if you like research data management and you are interested to the subject, please join us in the Ottawa Data Champion. We are recruiting data champions to help us in this project. And you can find all the information on our website, and I will place the link on the chat. You can also access our website to learn more about the project, its initiatives, and how you can join the team. So without delonging more, we have today the session Electronic Health Information Sharing and Privacy Security. This session will last around 40 minutes, and we have 20 minutes for questions and answers. So you can place all the questions on the chat, or also after the presentation, you can open the mic and the camera and ask your questions. So I would like you to introduce to Dr. Khaled El Eman. He's a professor at the University of Ottawa in the Faculty of Medicine and School of Electrical Engineering and Computer Science. He is also the director of the multi-disciplinary Electronic Health Information Lab, conducting research on privacy-enhancing technologies to enable the sharing of research data. Thank you very much, Dr. Khaled, and the Zoom floor is yours. I'll stop sharing here.
You're mute.
Sorry.
No problem.
Let me just get my slides on here, and then I'll start sharing. So thank you very much for the opportunity to present to you today. So the topic is data sharing and how to protect privacy when sharing health information. And I'll give you an overview of some of the considerations, challenges, and approaches you can use to responsibly share information for research purposes mostly, but really for any secondary purpose. So in terms of disclosures, I'll talk about some of the technologies that we have developed in my lab, and we spun off in a company which was recently acquired by Aetion. So I do have an interest in some of the technologies that I'll be talking about today. So the agenda for today, there are 3 main topics. I'll start off with some basic concepts around data privacy and managing risks when sharing data. Then I'll talk about re-identification risk measurement here, just very briefly to give you a sense of how to evaluate risk, and then talk a little bit about the future and where I think data sharing is moving, given the evolving regulatory environment, and also the evolving technology environment. So what I will be talking about today is covered in a lot more depth. I've written four books on the topic. If you really want to learn more about data privacy and data identification and how to share data in a responsible way, I would recommend this book. It's a kind of an overview of the theory of identifiability and managing data risks when sharing health information, again, mostly for research purposes. And then the other texts are really policy and application and technology related books if you want to learn more about how to do this in practice. But I think the intro to the theory would be the first book in this list. It's been out now for 9 years. But I think a lot of the material is still quite relevant. So when talking about data, we'll start off with personal health information. So that's the information that's typically collected in the context of providing care and in electronic health records or some kind of clinical information system. Or on paper still on charts. And there are requirements on what you can do with this type of data. I'll refer to this data that's collected as personal health information. So this is essentially identifiable information collected from patients. And in the US under HIPAA, it's called protected health information, but we still use the PHI acronym. So when you collect this data in the context of providing care, there's usually some form of consent, either explicit consent or an implied consent from the patients that this data or this information can be used to provide care. In general, when you collect data with consent, the consent needs to be specific in the sense that the information is collected for a particular purpose, and you cannot use the information for a different purpose than the purpose for which the data was consented for. And so typically the purposes for which data was consented is called the primary purpose. So, I mean, in the context of care, the primary purpose will be the provision of care, and access is provided to the circle of care. So these will be all the providers and allied healthcare professionals who are providing care to a particular patient. So this is all covered under that consent. In a non-care setting, for example, if you're a company or you're conducting a survey, then there is, let's say, a stretching of the definition of what's covered by the consent. Some organizations can make a legitimate interest argument saying that they have a legitimate interest in using the data for a particular purpose in order to provide the service that the customer or the patient expects. And so they would argue that even though it's not explicitly stated in the consent, it's required to meet the expectations of the individuals who provided the data. And there's some guidance. There's some guidance from various regulators about what constitutes a legitimate interest argument or a defense of a legitimate interest argument. And then, of course, there's exceptions to the use and disclosure of PHI without consent. For example, you are allowed to share identifiable personal health information for reporting communicable diseases, as an example, or for some jurisdictions reporting, gunshot wounds, and so on. Therefore, there are some enumerated exceptions where even though data is collected for a particular purpose, the data can be shared or used for a completely different purpose if it meets certain criteria. And again, reported communicable diseases is one of those. So that's kind of the foundation for thinking about what you can and cannot do with data. So outside the primary purpose and the exceptions, everything else is a secondary purpose, right? And these are other purposes that you potentially want to use the data for that were not initially consented. And so in order to use data for secondary purposes, you are limited in the mechanisms or the authorities that allow you to do that. So one way is to create non-identifiable information, right? And a secondary purpose is really everything else. So, research is considered a secondary purpose. Public health is considered a secondary purpose. Marketing is considered a secondary purpose. And in order to use data or share data for a secondary purpose, one way is to make this data non-identifiable. In that case, once the data is non-identifiable, you can use it for the secondary purpose without having to go back and obtain additional consent. The identified information is not considered personal health information, and therefore it falls outside privacy statutes, and then which means that you can use it for these secondary purposes without consent, and you have fewer obligations on you to work with that data, do whatever you want with it, basically. As I mentioned, for primary purposes, billing and processing for insurance payments, these are typically considered primary purpose. The distinction between a primary purpose and a secondary purpose, in many cases it's obvious, but it's a legal question. It depends on your jurisdictions, what is considered primary and secondary, and therefore, if there's any question, it's really a legal question, and you should obtain legal advice whether a particular use of the data set is considered a primary or secondary purpose. But as a general statement, research and public health are considered to be secondary purposes. So in order to use data for these secondary purposes, you either have to de-identify the data, go back and obtain reconsent. In the case of research ethics boards can waive the consent requirement and allow you to use actually waive the consent and the identification requirement and allow you to use the PHI. So the REB can play an important role in this, in providing access to data for secondary purposes, but otherwise you have to either de-identify or reconsent. So other things, as I mentioned, if you're building models for marketing purposes, software testing is now generally considered as a secondary purpose. So if you are building an app, for example, and you have some data that you want to use to test your software app, and this data was collected from patients or initial users of your app, that's considered a secondary purpose. Or increasingly being considered a secondary purpose as well. So you can't just take data from users and use it for testing your app as is. You have to de-identify it or get direct consent to use their data for software testing. And then the whole issue of open data, of course, in general, I mean, unless you get express consent for releasing the data publicly, then you can't do that. And in general, just as a good practice for open data and open science initiatives, you still want to de-identify the data, even if the individuals provided consent. I think in most cases, the consent would promise to de-identify the data or anonymize the data anyway. But even if it didn't do so, just as a good practice, you would want to make the de-identified versions of those data sets public, rather than the raw versions of these data set. Okay, so in order to share data, then you have to understand whether, in order to use data, you have to decide whether your use is a primary purpose or a secondary purpose. If it's a primary purpose, then it's covered by the consent. If it's or if there's no exception, then it's a secondary purpose. There's no exception, you didn't obtain consent, then it's a secondary purpose. And under the secondary purposes, then you have to understand what are the authorities that you can use to or apply to use that data for whatever purpose you want, whether it's a research or public health or some other purpose. Right? So that's the first thing you always have to do, is understand what your authorities are for what you want to do with a particular data set. So let's assume that you've determined that you need to de-identify your data. That's the mechanism that is going to be applied here to ensure that you meet your legal obligations. So what is identifiability? And typically we think of identifiability as falling on a spectrum. So at one end of that spectrum, you have identifiable data. So this would be data with names and addresses and maybe pictures. And then here is non-identifiable data at the other end of the spectrum. And this spectrum is really a probability. So here, identifiable data, the probability of identifying a person from the data is 1. And here, the probability of identifying a person from the data is 0. And so you, as you de-identify the data, you're essentially moving it along the spectrum from identifiable to non-identifiable. And there are different states of data as you go there. So you start with identifiable data, so that's number 1. And then as you apply some transformations, it becomes pseudonymous data. And then if you apply transformations plus implement additional security and privacy controls, it's called strongly pseudonymous data. And then at the end here, if you keep applying more and more transformations and putting in place more and more controls, then you get anonymous data. And here I'm using anonymous and de-identified interchangeably to mean the same thing. So anonymous data is not considered personal information, or de-identified data is not considered personal information, which means that you don't have to obtain consent, and you can use it for purposes that were not anticipated at the outset when the data was collected. You get to anonymous data or de-identified data when you cross this anonymization threshold here. And anonymization threshold is really a probability, and there are some strong precedents for what's deemed to be an acceptable threshold. So once you can demonstrate that the probability of identifying an individual from a data set has moved beyond this threshold or is below this threshold, then you can make the case that you're working with anonymous or de-identified data. So I'll talk a little bit about pseudonymous data later on, but just to be clear, pseudonymous data is still considered PHI. So all of this is still considered PHI. Personal health information and all the obligations of privacy laws are applicable when you are working with personal information or PHI. It's only when you are working with anonymous or de-identified data that these obligations start to go away. They're not zero in practice, but they're significantly reduced. So it allows you to do more with the data. So here's some examples of what these obligations mean. This comes from the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation in Europe, but I think it's a good set of obligations that we're starting to see more and more in different statutes around the world. So identified data, you have to provide notice to the data subject. You need to have a legal basis for processing the data, such as legitimate interest or consent. Data subjects have rights to access their data, portability rights, to correct their data, to ask you to correct their data, to also to withdraw consent, and to delete their data. There are some limitations on cross-border transfers for identified data. So, for example, transfers, this is an ongoing issue right now, is transfers of data from Europe to the US, for example, have faced significant friction over the years. And I think yesterday, President Biden signed an executive order to try to address some of those elements of friction to enable easier flow of information or identified data from Europe to the US. But it's complicated. Cross-border transfers are always complicated, and there are requirements around these data transfers. Various practices around the protection of data and data security practices are needed. So you have to have pretty high levels of security to process identified data breach notification. So if there's a data breach of identified data, then there's a pretty high chance that you will have to notify regulators as well as the affected data subject. Data retention limitations, you can't keep the data forever. There are restrictions on how long and you can keep data after its primary purpose has been fulfilled. Lots of requirements around documentation, and then lots of requirements around vendor and sub-processor management. It's a lot of requirements for processing identified data. So as you move from that, from identified to anonymized, the extent of these obligations goes down. So in principle, as you can see here, that if it's anonymized data, really none of these obligations apply anymore, which can reduce the cost. So the economics of working with anonymized data are a lot more attractive because you don't have to put in place organizational mechanisms to do all of those things. And again, this is GDPR specific, but we're starting to see similar types of obligations in other statutes as well as different jurisdictions update their privacy laws. So this is one reason why you would want to anonymize the data, or another reason. First one is consent one, but another one is the number of obligations in general tends to be much lower if you can make the case that your information is anonymized or de-identified. Okay, so what does de-identification mean then? We've seen that de-identification has advantages. Well, how do you these advantages include reduction in your obligations? Another advantage is, again, related to consent is there's a lot of evidence for consent bias. So a few years ago, we did a systematic review of consent bias, and what we ended up doing was a systematic review of systematic reviews, because this topic has been studied so extensively. There's quite a lot of evidence demonstrating consent bias, which basically means that consenters and non-consenters differ in a systematic manner, and therefore you will always, so not always, but often get a systematically biased data set of consenters. And this is opt-in consent, opt-out consent. The pattern is emerged and for different types of consent. The exact bias will depend on the nature of the data set. It could be gender bias, it could be socioeconomic status bias, it could be disease severity bias. But in general, there's this pretty strong evidence that there's consent bias, which is another reason why if you want to avoid consent bias, then if you can use some of the other mechanisms for enabling access and sharing and processing and doing research with data, then you can avoid that consent bias. But also, as I mentioned, the obligations on processing the identified data tend to be significantly reduced. So how do you then de-identify information? I'll just give you a very quick tutorial, kind of the main points of how to think about de-identification. And so the main objectives of de-identification is to protect against identity disclosure, right? There are different types of disclosure, which are different types of privacy risks or attacks that can be performed on data set, but identity disclosure is the main one that most privacy regulations focus on. And that's, I'll talk about it in a moment, what identity disclosure is. It's important to understand that this is a risk management exercise. So it's intended to ensure that the risk is very small, that is below the threshold. It doesn't guarantee or ensure as a practical matter that the risk is zero. You can never guarantee or ensure that the risk is zero. There'll always be some risk of identity disclosure. We just want to make sure that it's low enough or that it's very small, that the data can be defensively described as non-identifiable. And then, of course, an important point here is that the act of de-identification does not require additional consent in most jurisdictions. So under Ontario's PHIPAA, for example, It's explicit that the act of de-identification does not require additional consent. And in other jurisdictions, it's strongly implied or explicit or read into it. There are many practical reasons why you don't want to obtain consent to de-identify, but as a practical matter, that's how most statutes are interpreted, in that you don't need consent to de-identify. It's either permitted use or it's considered to be a non-use, or a legitimate interest argument can be made. Okay. So even though the obligations on de-identified data or anonymized data are reduced, they're not necessarily zero. There's increasingly, we see a prohibition against re-identification. It's some jurisdictions, it's a criminal offense to re-identify a de-identified data without the permission of the data custodian, of the controller. And also, as we shall see, managing the risk of re-identification involves additional controls. And so the controls have to travel with the data. And because the controls have to travel with the data, you still have obligations to ensure that these controls are in place in order to make the claim that the data is de-identified, or the information is de-identified. So there's actually a consistent approach for de-identification. There's a number of different standards that have been published, and they all tend to be quite consistent with each other. I'll just highlight a couple. One is the Ontario Guideline for De-Identification, which describes a very operational methodology for how to de-identify data sets. And then very recently, Singapore has published a guide for basic anonymization, which is consistent with the Ontario one. But that's the most recent one. It just came out this summer, so a couple of months ago, it was published. But in general, most of the guidelines from regulators and from other large data custodians tend to be consistent about what is deemed to be acceptable de-identification practices as of today. So it's not true that there isn't guidance. There's actually a lot of guidance, and a lot of it is consistent. And maybe the challenge is there are many different guidance documents. I'd agree that could be a problem. But the problem is not that there isn't any. There's a lot of good material out there that can be followed in terms of what are deemed to be generally accepted practices for de-identifying personal health information, or in general the identification of any type of information. So a key concept then, when you think about identifiability, is making a distinction between direct identifiers and indirect identifiers. So direct identifiers are things like name, email address, social insurance number, social security number, biometrics, health insurance numbers, full residential address, etc., fax numbers. And if you get any piece of information, it has direct identifiers, then it's clearly identified information or identifiable information. So the process of pseudonymization is when you get rid of this, right? You remove this information, and that's called pseudonymization. So you get rid of this information by either encrypting it, hashing it, removing it, replacing it with random values. There are a number of different ways that you would pseudonymize data by getting rid of direct identifiers. And the approach you would choose will depend on what you're trying to do. Whether you're trying to do research on the data, or you're trying to do software testing on the data, and so on. Different things different approaches you may use depending on what you're planning. So pseudonymous data is still PHI, right? Still personal health information or personal information. We see a lot of organizations that will just pseudonymize their data and then claim it's done, it's de-identified, and they then apply the secondary purposes on it. So you can do that because you're still processing personal information or personal health information. And unless you've completely de-identified the data set, or you have some other authority, exception, or make a legitimate interest argument, or you have consent, you can't process the PHI, right? Pseudonymization is not enough. It's a necessary first step to protect the data and make it suitable for analysis as non-identifiable information, but it's insufficient, right? And it's really important to keep that in mind. Pseudonymization is insufficient. Just removing the name and email address and all that stuff is not sufficient. The reason is you have a lot of these indirect identifiers in the data set, right? So indirect identifiers are also known as quasi-identifiers, include things like postal code, age, race, ethnicity, language spoken at home, income, any visible characteristics, dates of important events. So these are examples of indirect identifiers. Now, almost all known re-identification attacks on data sets were done on pseudonymous data, which means that the indirect identifiers were there. And almost all of them used the indirect identifiers to re-identify individuals. So we know, just as a matter of evidence, that pseudonymous data with all the indirect identifiers intact can be re-identified. So, for example, in a Canadian context, date of birth and full postal code is unique for the vast majority of the population. Depending on the province, this could be almost everyone, actually. And in other countries, European countries, it's the same thing. Just because postal codes tend to be small and have a small number of households, when you combine that with date of birth, it becomes a unique identifier. And in the US, zip codes and date of birth can also uniquely identify a majority of the population. Various numbers have been calculated, varying from 67 to 83%. Or higher, depending on which study you look at, but it's still a majority of the population. So, so we know that individuals can be re-identified with indirect identifiers. So, what we want to do then is to transform these indirect identifiers in some manner to ensure that the ability to re-identify individuals from these indirect identifiers is small. So what we have to do then in order to de-identify data is pseudonymize plus transform. Okay, that's a requirement to be able to claim that you've properly de-identified information. So let's look at some examples. So identity disclosure is when you assign an identity to a record in a data set. So if you think of this data set as sex, year of birth, and drug code, and the indirect identifiers or quasi-identifiers are sex and year of birth in this example, there are no direct identifiers, so we've removed all the direct identifiers. We've removed the name and the address, etc. We only have the quasi-identifiers in the data, and so we have this data set with 11 records in it. If we can match this record here, female born in 1989, with Sally, then that's an identity disclosure. We have correctly matched a record to a real person. So that's what we're trying to avoid, trying to make it difficult to assign a real identity to a record. Here we've generalized the year of birth to a decade of birth, right? And so when you generalize to a decade of birth, now you have two females born between 80 and 89. And so that increases the uncertainty. So we don't know now which record matches Sally, because if we have no other information, there's a 50-50 chance that either one of those two records belongs to Sally. So generalization is one approach to reduce the probability of matching a person to a record. With generalization, of course, you're losing information. There's an information loss that's occurring because now we are changing the precise 1989 year of birth to a decade of birth. But we've reduced the risk because we've introduced this uncertainty about the matching between the record and the person. And so generalization in this way is one technique for reducing risk. You can also add noise. You can remove the records from the data set, and various other techniques can be used, which are more complex. But by transforming the data, you can reduce the matches, the likelihood of successful match between the records in the data set and real people. And then also, there are two ways to attack a data set. We call this the population to sample attack. So in this case, you have an attacker or an adversary who knows Sally and knows that she was born in 1989. So the attacker has some information specifically about Sally and is trying to match Sally with records in the data set. And so this is called also an acquaintance attack, and you assume that there's an acquaintance who has information about Sally, which may include other details that are not publicly known, such as her allergies, her diagnosis, major procedures, etc., and can use that information to re-identify the records that belong to Sally. And these types of attackers, these acquaintances could be neighbors, relatives, co-workers, and they're also famous people are vulnerable to this in the sense that there's a lot of public information about them. Like politicians or actors or sports personalities, etc. And there are known attacks on politicians to kind of expose their health of information in this manner. So this is not hypothetical. So that's one type of attack. And then another type of attack is you start off with a data set and you don't really have anyone in mind that you want to re-identify. So you try to find a registry, say a population registry, that lists everybody in the population. So in certain countries, this could be a voter registration list, for example, which would include basic demographics about individuals. But there are other ways to create registries. So you take a record from your data set and that's of interest to you, or even in cases we have seen where any record is of interest because the objective is to demonstrate that the data set is not safe, and therefore any record is chosen, or the most likely record to be re-identified that has the most unusual characteristics, and then you try to find individuals in the registry to match against. And so here you have a single record that can potentially match two people, and in this case, the probability of a correct match is a half, because it matches two people. But if there's only one person that has the characteristics in the record, then that's a unique match, and you've essentially re-identified that record. So there are two types of attacks then. One is acquaintance, where an attacker knows someone and is trying to find them in a data set, and the other one is you take a data set and you try to match it with anybody in the population through some kind of some kind of population registry. And both types of attacks have occurred in practice. There's a very robust literature on re-identification attacks. Papers are being published today. Every few weeks, we see one coming out. Someone's doing another type of attack. Sometimes they're good attacks. Sometimes they're really not that great attacks. They're kind of exaggerating their impact. But there's a constant, steady stream of work and publications on re-identification attacks on data sets. So it's important to have good practices to de-identify data. So how do you measure risk? So the risk is really measured by the group size. So in this particular case, all the records are unique. And so the risk is really 1 divided by the group size. So when all the records are unique, then the risk is 1 for every single record in the data set. And the group size is basically how many records exist with the same values on your quasi-identifiers or indirect identifiers, which are in this case sex and year of birth. But if we said here generalized to decade of birth, then here we have group sizes of 3 and group sizes of 2, etc. So the risk is 1 over the group size. And in the case of Sally here, she's in a females born between 80 and 89. It's a size of 2, group size of 2. So the risk, Sally's risk of her records being re-identified is basically 0.5. So you can assign probabilities to records in a data set in terms of the likelihood of a successful re-identification. And just to add a bit more color to this, you actually don't measure the risk in the data set, you measure the risk in the population. So in practice, you also need to know how many females born in between 80 and 89 in the population. and then it's 1 over the group size in the population. And this is where the whole area of statistical disclosure control comes in, where people have developed many estimators to estimate the group sizes and populations from the information in the data set, micro data set. So there are a lot of ways to estimate these values. But there's a body of work on risk estimation and risk calculation for the 2 directions of attack, and the basic principle for measuring those is group size. So as I mentioned before, there's an identifiability, and if you cross the threshold, then becomes non-identifiable or anonymized data. The identifiability threshold that's often used, recommended by Health Canada, for example, is 0.09 as at least a starting point, and you can reduce it for more sensitive data, but there's quite strong precedence for what is deemed to be an acceptable risk. And then, as we mentioned before, pseudonymous data is on this side of the spectrum, so it's still considered to be personal information. And de-identified or anonymous data is on the other side of the spectrum because it has a risk that's below the threshold. And there are metrics, as I mentioned, to measure this quantity. So if you can measure it and you have a threshold, then you can start making some somewhat defensible claims that the risk is small. There's a privacy utility trade-off, of course, because as I mentioned before, when you transform the data by generalizing it or adding noise, you are losing information. And so if you want maximum utility, you have the lowest privacy, which is this point here. If you want maximum privacy, then that's the minimum utility, which essentially means you don't share any data. But in practice, you want a value somewhere here where you achieve an acceptable trade-off between utility and privacy. There's no point in transforming data so much that you can't do anything useful with it. So you always try to find an equilibrium where these two things can be traded off in a reasonable way. But that's not all, because as I mentioned before, you also have to consider controls. So the way the risk is actually measured is you look at the data transformations that you do. So we talked about generalization, said suppression, there's addition of noise, there's a technique called microaggregation, but also it's combined with controls. So you apply the data transformations, and then any residual risk that's remaining, that keeps the data above the threshold, is managed by additional controls, security controls, privacy controls, and contractual controls. So really, the overall risk of a data set is a combination of whatever transformations you've done and whatever controls you put in place. And so these two things always go together, and the controls have to travel with the data to ensure that the combination of transformed data and controls provides a very low, a small risk. And the reason this is important is that data sets have become so complex that data transformations alone will not be enough. You will lose a lot of data utility if you rely on data transformations alone. And therefore, you need to do some data transformations, and there'll be some residual risk, which you then have to manage through these controls. And so there are risk models to combine both of these things together to tell you how many controls you need to manage and the types of controls you need to manage this residual risk. So that's the model that's been in use today, up till recently. But the challenges, as I mentioned, there are continuous claims of successful re-identification attacks. Most of these attacks, as I mentioned, were done on pseudonymous data sets that were not properly de-identified. But there are some attacks that are done on de-identified data sets as well. And we can argue about whether these attacks are good or bad and whether they're real or not. But the narrative that's been developing over the last few years is negative around de-identification, and regulators are increasingly being skeptical or concerned about how effective de-identification really is. So we need better tools and better techniques for ensuring that de-identification is working. And so there's actually a range of privacy-enhancing technologies that allow us to do that. So far, I was talking about risk-based identification, which is number one, but other techniques that are emerging and are starting to be used are synthetic data generation, federated analysis, or secure multi-party computation, and differential privacy. So all of these are more modern techniques for protecting against identity disclosure. And I won't go through them today, of course, just to say that there are advances in technologies and approaches to protect information against identity disclosure beyond the traditional risk-based identification methods. And this is where we're headed. Like, we're headed in a direction where more and more of these other techniques are being deployed in practice to address the concerns of regulators and the public and civil society about the strength of the identification. So the work that I do is with synthetic data generation. So I'll just give you one slide on synthetic data generation, and then I'll close. And then hopefully we'll have some questions. So the basic idea behind synthetic data generation is you take a source data set of some sort, could be a clinical trial data set, a real world data set, and then you fit a model, machine learning model that learns the patterns in this source data set. And then you generate new data from the model. And that is your synthetic data. So the synthetic data is not generated, it's generated from a model. And this is where it gets its privacy protective characteristics, because the records in the synthetic data don't have a one-to-one mapping to the source data. And you've seen synthetic data before in the form of these deepfakes. So these are all fake people. Actually, this is even an old picture now. Old pictures, the newer ones are even better. But anyway, these are all fake people. They're not real people. They were trained from models that were generated from models that were trained on images of real people. And as you can see, they look very realistic. And it's difficult to actually tell whether they're real or not. There've been some recent studies showing deepfakes and real pictures, and the respondents were not able to tell the difference between them. And also they indicated that they trusted the fake ones more than the real ones, which is a testament to how good deepfakes have become, but also a little bit scary. So you can apply the same technologies to generate structured data, as in the example here. This is an example of an oncology clinical trial data set that's been synthesized. So all the values are not real, but they retain the patterns and the characteristics from the original data. So that way you're able to analyze the data, get similar results, same conclusions as the source data, but still have the privacy protective characteristics, because there's no one-to-one mapping between the synthetic data and the source data set. So that's one of the emerging technologies that is coming through to allow us to use data and disclose data for secondary purposes without having to obtain additional consent. And I'll stop here, and hopefully you'll have lots of questions for me.
Thanks very much, Khaled. That was a real learning experience for me and hopefully others. So I see Catherine has a question. I'm becoming involved in using MD clone and synthetic data. Are there protocols that apply to synthetic data, since M-clone screens any items that might be hooked to personal identification?
Yeah, I mean, I won't comment on MD clone specific technology, but I'll just state a few requirements that are important to keep in mind. One is it's important to have metrics, privacy metrics for the synthetic data. There are metrics out there, but you want to have credible, validated privacy metrics for the synthetic data to have some confidence that the risks in the synthetic data are low. One of the challenges with synthetic data is if this model here that you fit, if it's overfit, then it'll replicate the original source data. So you have to be careful about overfitting. And overfitting is a common problem with machine learning models. So you want to avoid overfitting, and one way to evaluate that or get some comfort that there's no overfitting is to look at the privacy metrics and ensure that they're small. And then the other thing is you have to evaluate synthetic data in the proper manner. And the proper manner is multiple imputation type approach, where you generate multiple synthetic data sets, analyze them, each one of them and then combine the model estimates from each of these analyses to get the final model estimates. So it's this classic multiple imputation. The combining rules are different, but a classical multiple imputation. The reason you do this is because synthesis introduces variation in the data set, and you have to account for that variation to get valid inferences, valid population inferences from your synthetic data. So you have to do valid analysis, and you have to ensure that you have privacy metrics. And if you have both of those things in place, then synthetic data will give you a good solution for managing those risks and give you access to data, more robust access to data sets.
Thank you for that, and hopefully that will help Catherine. Felicity is asking, could we get some links to these guidance documents, especially Ontario, Canada? The titles are small on my screen for Googling.
Yeah, absolutely. I can send the slide deck to Anna and David afterwards, so you'll have the titles.
Okay.
And then if you Google the titles, you'll get them. All of them are publicly available documents.
Right. Thanks for that, Khaled. Lisa is asking, we are now required to make our data accessible to other researchers. This was not included in our consent forms. The data do not include direct PHI, but do include indirect PHI, which are important to include. Age, sex, health condition, but could realistically be used to ID individuals since the population is small. Can we decline to publish the data?
Well, I don't know. It depends on your funder, whether they make it a requirement or not, and the journals where you publish, whether they make it a requirement or not. But I think that arguing that it's not possible to create non-identifiable versions of a data set is becoming a difficult argument to defend, because the methods for synthesis and just motor methods for identification are quite good. They're not perfect, but they're quite good. The problem is you need funding to do that. So the funders have to allocate resources for preparing data sets for broader dissemination, because it's not cost-free. It takes time, it takes expertise, it may require additional tools. And so some funders are starting to allow and allocate funds for preparing data sets for broader dissemination, because if you don't allocate resources, it's just not going to be done, or it's not going to be done well. There are few circumstances where you can argue it cannot be de-identified if you have a very rare disease, or if if it's a case analysis where you're just looking at one case. But I think as a general statement, it's becoming a harder argument to make. The challenge that I see for many groups is that they don't have the funds and they don't have the expertise, which is related to funds, to prepare safe data sets for broader dissemination. It's not because we don't know how to do it well, it's for other reasons that this is not happening. And I think certainly the journals have some understanding of these constraints, but over time, it's going to become a harder or more difficult argument to keep making moving forward, I think.
Thank you. So Felicity is asking, I have questions about building teams to support the resource-intensive requirements of de-identification and anonymization. Is there an ideal mode? How hard is it to hire this expertise? And another question is, when de-identified anonymized data sets are submitted to journals, repositories, can you comment on how these infrastructure could or should evaluate the quality of the work?
So in terms of the first question, we provide training courses for this. So that's always one option. But I do admit that it's hard to find the expertise. Hopefully, with more pressure from funders, that there'll be incentives to develop that expertise over time. But at least for our community, we have we do a training course specifically focused on this. In terms of sorry, what was your second point?
When de-identified anonymized data sets are submitted to journals, repositories, can you comment on how these infrastructures could be?
Yeah. So the repositories will not ensure the quality of the identification, and I think in most cases they will protect themselves in the terms of use, that they're not accountable or responsible for the identification that's applied. So it's always going to be the responsibility of the data depositor to ensure that the practices used to prepare those data sets before they're deposited are adequate enough. Some repositories provide guidance on what are deemed to be acceptable practices, but they still don't take responsibility for it. It's always on the depositor or the research group or the sponsor of the study to ensure that the practices that were used are defensible. But I mean, there are good precedents. Like Health Canada now requires the public release of clinical study reports for drugs and devices that they approve to be posted online, and they've already made millions of pages of clinical reports publicly available. So has the European Medicines Agency, for that matter, and they provided some good guidance on the identification for public release. This is for documents, not for structured data, but the principles are the same. And then there's a different, less conservative set of guidelines for non-public release of or sharing of data sets. So it's important to make a distinction between public and non-public release of data sets, because the approaches you would use will be slightly different. But some organizations are releasing large amounts of health information publicly, and have been for a few years now. So again, it brings me back to the point where it's harder to make the case that it's not possible to do this, because some of the clinical trials are small as well. I mean, clinical trials are traditionally a few hundred patients. They're not very large. Some are large, but many are not. So, and these have been identified, and the clinical reports have been published online on these regulator websites. So, but again, they don't take responsibility. It's always the responsibility of the sponsor to ensure that the identification applied is adequate, notwithstanding that the EMA and Health Canada provide guidelines for how to do that. So that's going to be the case for the foreseeable future. You need to develop your own expertise, or funders can provide expertise or provide centers of excellence to support projects that they fund, or could be part of bigger initiatives to concentrate this expertise to support multiple groups or efforts, so that data can be shared much more broadly. I think the obstacle is people don't want to share their data. It's not because they don't know how to protect privacy. I mean, there's just still reluctance to share data, but I think that the privacy concerns are they're surmountable. Like, we know how to do this, we know how to do it well if the resources are made available. But I think in practice, some of the reluctance is not related to privacy per se. Privacy is used as an excuse not to make data available. So that's my observation anyway.
Thanks, Khaled. And maybe I could ask a question, and due to time, it may be the last question. So I think what you've sort of indicated to us is that when we're putting in a grant application, I think you're saying to us we should have a budget line item for, in a sense, data sharing that might include all of this sort of anonymization and much of what you've talked about today. From a practical perspective, what should that be? Should we be putting in a budget line item for $2,000, or should we be putting in a budget line item for $5,000? What would you recommend?
Well, it depends on the complexity of the data set you want to share and what kind of infrastructure support you have in place to to do this. So if you have infrastructure, you have expertise, you have a team, then the cost can be in the 2,000 to 5,000. I mean, I know Wellcome Trust was estimating that for them it was their view of the cost was 2,000 to 5,000 pounds. But I think that assumes you have expertise in-house and you have existing infrastructure. If you don't have that, it'll probably be higher. And then also depends on the complexity of the data set. For most analysis-ready data sets that are analyzed for publications, the data sets are not that complex. The source data set may be very complex, but it's cleaned, it's normalized, it's reduced to essentially a single tabular data set that you can run through, SAS. So those analysis-ready data sets tend to be simpler, which means that the burden is less, but the data complexity will always be a factor here. So in those cases, if you have nothing and it's a complex data set, the actual cost can be quite a bit higher.
Okay. Thank you so much, Khaled. I see we're on the hour, and I know that people will have to leave. But I certainly learned an awful lot, so I really appreciate you taking the time, and I want to also wish everyone a great rest of the day. So thank you very much.
Great. Thank you.
Take care.
Bye.